The growth of slavery. By the early 18th century, Chesapeake landowners were buying more slaves, and Virginia developed the largest African population in the colonies. By 1750, more than 100,000 African Americans lived there, out of a total population of 230,000 people in the colony. Through the 18th century, slavery also grew tremendously farther south. In South Carolina, black slaves outnumbered white colonists. Slave populations increased very quickly during the 18th century. Meanwhile, the number of slaves grew in parts of the North as well, with New York and New Jersey having the most slaves in the region. Still, the number of slaves in the middle colonies and New England remained small compared to the South. Parts of those northern regions had more freemen living there than in the South, especially after 1750. Slaves sometimes bought their own freedom, and in some cases they earned more money to buy the freedom of relatives. Some masters left instructions in their wills to free their slaves. Other slaves simply ran away and managed to escape capture. Rise of slavery in the Low Country. The English began settling the Low Country, what became North Carolina and South Carolina, during the 1660s and 1670s. The settlers were English planters who had run large plantations in the West Indies using slave labor. They sought to do the same in America. Later, after Georgia, the last of the 13 English colonies, was founded in 1732, slavery arrived there as well. Both Georgia and South Carolina had warm, swampy conditions along their coasts that were perfect for growing rice. African slaves had experienced growing rice from their lives in Africa, so they often made better workers than Europeans did. Rice plantations, worked by large numbers of African slaves, dotted the coasts of both colonies. Some slaves were responsible for cooking and preparing food. Rice was an important crop in Georgia and the Carolinas. Many slaves came to the region through Charleston, South Carolina, which had a large slave market. Some 94,000 slaves were sold there between 1706 and 1776. The colonies in the South became what some historians call slave societies. The presence of many enslaved Africans shaped the economy and culture of the region. In general, across the South, the wealthiest planters owned the most slaves. Small farmers might own one or two at most, and many owned none. Across the colonies, only about 25% of white colonists owned slaves. As slavery increased in the South, the number of free Africans fell. By the American Revolution, only about 5% of the African Americans in the Chesapeake region and North Carolina were free. Northern slavery in the 18th century. As in earlier times, Northerners who owned slaves in the 18th century often had only 2 or 3. Slaves usually worked on smaller farms or in the household. One exception was in Rhode Island, where several families owned dozens of slaves to run plantations like the ones in the South. In part of that colony, as many as 1/3 of the workers were African American slaves. Spotlight on slave markets. Slave markets showed what white colonists thought of enslaved Africans. Slave traders often kept the slaves in jail before bringing them to market, where several hundred slaves might be sold at one time. To owners, slaves were simply property, but valuable property, because they provided so much labor. Buyers looked over their purchases carefully, trying to avoid slaves who might have diseases or physical problems. Slave markets were found in both the North and the South. At times, Africans were sold right at the docks where slave ships arrived. Importing slaves into the United States was legal until 1808. Some families owned just one or two slaves to help with housework.